Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. My name is Joseph Orozco. I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to envision a future free of oppression, exploitation, domination, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we have initiated is this forum, Conversations on Anarres, in which we talk to scholars, writers, artists, and organizers about the work they do to try to bring about these alternative futures. I'm very excited today about our guest. It's a deep honor to have her here today. I've been a big fan of her work and her thinking about the Star Trek universe and science fiction in general for some time. And she has agreed to come on to the program. My guest today is Dr. Una McCormack. She is a New York Times bestselling author, and for over 20 years, she has written franchise fiction or novel tie-in stories for several major science fiction franchises, including Star Trek, Firefly, and Doctor Who. In particular regard to Star Trek, she has written several novels that illuminate the world of Cardassia from DS9. And she's been an author of two fictional autobiographies in the Star Trek universe, that of Captain Catherine Janeway and of the iconic character Mr. Spock. She has degrees in history, political science, psychology. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Surrey. I've asked her to come today to talk to us about her writing process and the preparation for the kind of work that she does, but also how she understands the kind of future portrayed in the Star Trek universe and the way in which we are picturing the future of humanity today through speculative fiction and film. So help me to welcome Dr. Una McCormack.
Oh, thank you very much. That really lovely introduction. That's very kind of you. I'm delighted to be here. I love the podcast. I listen as often as I can, and not just to the Star Trek episodes.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that very much. It's been a long time coming to speak with you, and I hope that we can continue to speak. Because so much of my understanding of the Star Trek universe has been illuminated through your work, but I want to get to that a little bit later. But I'm just a very big fan, and so I thank you for taking time out to speak with us a little bit. But as I mentioned in the introduction, part of the Anarres project, we are inspired by the work of Ursula K. Le Guin. Not only was she local to us here in Oregon, but just a grand visionary and someone who is very thoughtful about the ways in which we imagine the reaches of the radical imagination about what is possible for humanity in the future. And she was someone who was very concerned with this, not only in her work but in her own personal life. And so we enjoy speaking with authors who have this kind of inspiration for their own work. And this is something that you bring, I think, to the writing that you do. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your writing process and how you think about your work. As I mentioned, you've been writing science fiction franchise novels. So this is fiction that is a little bit different than fan fiction, in the sense that fan fiction is a lot of amateurs do fan fiction as sort of a hobby. They sort of write about their favorite characters in their different universes. You've taken this to a professional level. You are now someone that people in Star Trek come and reach out to, producers in the world, and say, "Hey, we want you to do." Right, the autobiography of Mr. Spock or something. So this is a professional vocation for you. But I want to sort of step back to all of this and ask you about your beginnings with science fiction. Um, uh, you've written more than probably 15, 20 different science fiction novels.
I think we're at 20 now. Yeah,
Yeah,
easily. Yeah.
set in a variety of universes, right? So you are conversant in this with Star Trek characters, with Doctor Who, Firefly, and then sort of universes of your own creation. But how did you become a fan of science fiction in general? What was it that brought you to this particular kind of literature?
So I think I am of a certain age that saw Star Wars in the cinema at a very, very impressionable moment, which was shortly before my 6th birthday. And I think if you get a sort of imaginative 6-year-old, and indeed it happened to my own imaginative 6-year-old, and you put them in a cinema and you show them a spectacle like that, then that child is going to want to go into space. Yeah. Now, because I was quite a bookish and not outdoorsy child, I didn't actually want to go into space because obviously that's stressful and exhausting and terrifying. And I could quite happily go there in my imagination. So it was that spectacular image first, and then I think we were. What happened next was that I watched a British TV show called Blake Seven, um, which is almost the anti-Trek in a way. I don't know how well known it is over in the States, but it's a very bleak show about a rebel group, a terrorist group. Actually, they commit assassinations and bombings and so forth, and they are trying to overthrow a totalitarian regime known as the Federation. So. They are busy fighting a losing battle, and I got very involved in that show. And again, I was only about 8, 9, or 10. Partly, I think, because I was from an Irish background. I'm born in Britain, but with sort of Irish grandparents and so forth on both sides, and who very much, particularly my father, identified with the Republican struggle. So Blake Seven spoke to me. It's the height of the Troubles as well, remember? So a TV show in Britain about terrorists and from the point of view of those people was quite strong. I don't think you get that now. So Blake Seven really grabbed me, and I was writing fan fiction, in fact, from a very young age. When it came to Star Trek, it was quite tricky to watch Star Trek in Britain. I know it was in syndication in the States, but during the 70s and early 80s, you couldn't really see Star Trek very easily in Britain. So my first introduction, and this was a great introduction, again, I was exactly the right age, was the movies, um, possibly the motion picture. I can't quite remember. But certainly, I mean, what did you do as a teenager in the 80s? You went out and saw the latest blockbuster film, didn't you? So yeah, of course you're going to go. You're going to see Star Wars. You're going to see E.T. You're going to see possibly Close Encounters a bit early. You're going to see all the Star Trek films. You're going to see Back to the Future, Raise the Lost Ark. So it's part of this great. I mean, they were brilliant films. We were really lucky, weren't we? Just really good action adventure. But it was the Star Trek films that I really loved and enjoyed. Um, and then, so round about 87, of course, we started to hear that this new Star Trek was coming. But of course, I was stuck in benighted Blighty, and laying your hands on Star Trek: The Next Generation was unbelievably difficult. I was renting they were releasing 2 cassettes every other month with 2 episodes on. So I would nip into Blockbuster Video and kind of rent these and then wear it out. I'd watch them both again and again. All my friends would be out drinking on a Friday night, and I'd be at home rewatching The Naked Now. Yeah, it's so difficult to get hold of this stuff. And then from there, it was I met some friends who online friends, Blake Seven fans who not online. They were getting tapes shipped in from the States. Yeah, so they kind of record a season or half a season and send it over, and also it was different video formats, so it had to go through a conversion. It was an unbelievably complicated way to kind of watch. And then I started reading the novels as well. So I started reading sort of Jean Laura next gen novels. So yeah, that was the 1980s and trying to lay your hands on Star Trek. I was much more a consumer of TV than of written science fiction. I think Le Guin really was pretty much. There was a lot of young adult science fiction I was reading, but Le Guin, I had a copy of The Compass Rose that I read over and over and over again. And obviously, I'd read Earthsea and so forth. But yeah, it was mostly TV and Star Trek from a much earlier age than I think I've realised.
Wow, that's quite the struggle actually to get a hold of this, because I
Yeah,
wasn't aware
exactly.
of how difficult it was.
Oh, you
Uh,
had to commit. Yeah.
yeah, no, that shows dedication. I'm surprised. I've heard of Blake Seven. I have not seen it. I'm not sure if it's widely available. Was widely available here. Um, I'm surprised to hear of its popularity there in the UK at this time,
Mm.
considering, right, that. Uh, uh, there was still some troubles with trying to get that one Star Trek episode about Irish unification in 2024 that was banned from the
Yeah.
UK for a long
Well,
time.
that was a little more on the nose, I think we
Yeah, I
might say.
suppose so, right?
It's
If you
science
announce it
fiction.
rather, yeah,
Yeah, exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Blake Seven was BBC One. It was the main channel.
hmm,
It was prime time. It's sort of 7:10 in the evening. It was
wow,
watched. Everybody watched it. It's very dated. It's very slow. It's sort of, if you take an episode of Doctor Who and then make it longer, then it's it's but with perhaps the same material. But I love it, and the moments of gold are absolute gold. So if you can find
interesting.
it on BritBox or something like that,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, take a little look. I described it, or a friend and I describe it as having a curious mixture of tinsel and nihilism. So, which
Interesting,
is,
interesting.
yeah.
Well, what's interesting too about what you said is the way that you came through Star Wars to
Mm.
Star Trek in a variety of ways, right? Sort of very different kinds of stories, or thinking about speculative worlds. Is there something that spoke to you about Star Trek in particular that you landed there as opposed to the early love of Star Wars?
I think there was more of it. I'm pretty sure that it was Voyage Home. I think I just really loved the one with the whales. I think it tickled my sense of humor. Um, I think it was just good fun. It's a good question, because I never really got into Star Wars in the same way. Um, and I can't say it was to do with there being more female characters on screen. I possibly there was just that pipeline from the movies into next gen. And really there wasn't that with Star Wars, was there? So no, I didn't go tracking down Star Wars novels or anything like that. I had a feeling that I don't know how I got this feeling. I think I may have felt that Star Wars was more of a boys franchise. So I didn't go into it. Now my daughter knows more about it than I do. So, that shows you
Yeah,
the difference. Yeah.
that's really interesting. I
Um,
mean, I admit too that, in my Star Trek journey, Star Wars was there, but it never spoke to me in the same way.
mm,
And it wasn't until very recently, actually, and I think it's been mostly watching the streaming shows, Mandalorian
mm,
and Ashoka particularly has really
mm,
Andor, that have filled in certain kinds of
mm.
spaces in that universe that make me think it's much more. There's much more depth there, or they at least they've gone into much more depth in
Yeah.
ways that I think are really fascinating. But the early films were fun, but they didn't speak to me at that sort of like level
Yeah.
of awe and wonder that I often was left with after watching a Star Trek episode.
I think on some level I knew even at that age that it was actually fantasy and not science fiction. And wasn't quite operating in the same mode. And I think science fiction was much more where I tended towards. I will say Andor is one of my favorite shows of the past decade. I've just published an essay on Andor actually. I absolutely love it, and I've loved these new shows. But yeah, I think I knew it was actually swords and sorcery. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, and and a lot of our discussions have been. I've been sort of converted by some of my students. Actually, one of my students,
Mm,
now colleague, who's a PhD candidate in political science, Mohammed Shakibnia. He's written a few essays on the important kind of anti-imperialist narrative
mm,
in Star Wars. That's really convinced me that there's a lot more going on here.
yeah, yeah.
I'm excited about that. But I want to talk about your writing a
Mm,
little bit. So I want to say I have to admit I haven't read your autobiography of Catherine Janeway. It's on my wish
mm,
list. I've been wanting to get a hold of it. I just haven't had a chance to yet. But I did read. Um, the autobiography of Mr. Spock.
Mm.
So, one, could you describe a little bit about what these autobiographies are? And can you talk a little bit about how you went to the preparation of doing these fictionalized, these novelized autobiographies with these iconic characters, particularly Spock? How did you
Yeah.
go about preparing to write those?
Yeah, well, Spot was pretty daunting, I can tell you. So what this series is the conceit is that they are the autobiographies of certain characters, and there are institutional and bizarre reasons why they're being published in this way, but I won't go into that. But it's very straightforward. What you're getting is the first two books by David Goodman are Kirk and Picard, and they're memoirs. They're memoirs by fictional characters, and the conceit is that David Goodman, then I, and then now Derek Tyler Attico, who's just published Cisco's. It's wonderful autobiography. We're almost like the interviewers or the editors. So they play to my strengths, which is that I love first person. So they're all in first person, and that means that I can. One of my favorite, the thing I enjoy writing most is voice, is getting voice, as if you can hear that character speak. Um, so, like I say, they play to my strengths. I guess in terms of preparation, obviously you rewatch everything. Yeah. Okay. So you kind of I had a pretty intense couple of months where I rewatched Voyager. It was pretty full on. But that's part of the immersion. I think any kind of substantive piece of creative writing, you've got to get quite deeply immersed into it, and so do your family by default. So I got quite deeply immersed in that. I think the other things that I try and do, so obviously I would kind of follow up with interviews with the actors. So I read quite a lot about what Kate Mulgrew had to say about Janeway, what lots and lots of people had to say about Spock. Um, and I also, as much as I can, try and read academic or substantial kind of reflections and analyses. So there's an essay that's very important on influence on the Spot book, which is an essay by Erin Horokova. It's called Kirk Drift, and it talks about the mismatch between our popular understanding of Kirk as kind of womanizer and all these sorts of things, reckless, bold, and what Kirk is actually like when you watch on screen, which is quite rational, quite measured, um, a man with a reputation as a student for being bookish and scholarly, a survivor of massacres. Yep. So the difference between what Kirk is like on screen and our popular conception of him, and that was a really big influence on how I wrote Kirk in that book. So you've got this huge sort of a ton of material, and then I think you have to think of yeah, there are two things you have to do kind of in terms of structuring the narrative. You have to decide where this story is being told from. So the moment in that life. It's pretty straightforward with Janeway. But we went round the houses a few times with Spock, and we settled on it's the moment just before he goes on board the jellyfish to go off on the mission that leads to the red batter and all that. So that was the moment that we sort of picked. So I said there were two things. There's sort of three. The third one is, and these are all basic questions that you always ask yourself when you're writing: who the addressee is, and again, I think the Spock one. Janeway's is much more open. It's much more a sort of public address in a way. It's a public presentation of a narrative, which leads to interesting things because what she's concealing and what she's not talking about. But Spock is addressed directly to Picard, who he's made his literary executor. That's the kind of conceit of the book. Um, and then I guess that the big question, apart from those sort of moments of the narrative, the addressee, you get down to structuring the material. Because what these books don't want to be is a kind of summary of episodes. Yeah. So it's the whole life, and really you want to sort of dispense with on screen stuff as quickly as possible because reading an episode summary you can just do that on Memory Alpha. Yeah, okay. I'm going to first person narrate it, but it's not interesting. It's not much fun for you as a writer either. So Spock's, I think, was pretty complicated. I came up with this idea of a kind of wisdom book that Vulcans write as a kind of reflection on their life and what they've lived. And throughout it, we've got a sense of what was in Sarex, which is very, objective and doesn't, refer to love and life and family and these kinds of things. And then we've got Spock's, which is a bit messier. Yeah, just what Spock is like. So we had that structure, and then with Spock, of course, uh, not only we were doing the original series movies, oh no, we had Discovery to bring in. We had Strange New Worlds to not contradict that hadn't been on screen. We had, had to get Cybok in. You had to get the Red Angel in. And I'm particularly proud we got Yesteryear from the animated series. I managed to get that one in. So the Spot book really was a sort of and I love this kind of thing, synthesizing material. It's the academic training, isn't it? You sort of, you've been given all these sources, and now you've got to generate a thesis length piece of work on the back of it that's coherent and advances an argument. So I had a great time, but there was a lot of. I think when you go back to his childhood, now with all the discovery material, there's some pretty tightly scheduled days for young Spock. There's a lot going on, and we couldn't leave that out. So finding a way through that so that it didn't feel, um, and then, I think really was the big challenge. But I
Yeah,
had a
that
whale
that
of a
was
time.
that was
Yeah.
amazing to me about reading that is because I was just impressed with all the way in which there's a narrative woven around all of these different episodes, and that the way that you were able to include the life of Spock in the NuTrek. And I was just like, oh my God, this is such a complicated narrative, and there's all these
Yeah.
details. I mean, it's fun for a Star Trek fan to sort of find all the sort of Easter eggs in it and sort of see
Yeah.
all of that. But I was thinking about this as a writer, the way in which you had to sort of synthesize all of this was a monumental challenge with a life so complicated like Spock's. I
Yep.
mean, I've often thought that Spock is really, if there's a hero of this universe, it's really Spock because
Mm.
his life weaves through all the threads of this universe in a way that is intractable. And so trying
Yep.
to do that kind of work, it was quite impressive. But let me just say this. The other thing that was quite impressive about the autobiography of Spock is the emotional resonance that you were able to describe and put into it.
Thank you.
Particularly, I'll say this: the moment when Spock is talking about the death of Kirk, his
Mhm.
friend for life, in this kind of way, um, it was very deeply moving.
Thank
Um,
you.
so just the sense of loss and
Mm.
but with this kind of Vulcan stoicism, trying to portray
Mm.
that love
Yeah.
through a Vulcan mindset, uh, complicated to do,
Mm.
difficult for the Vulcans obviously to try to explain, but to make that loss feel like a real loss
Mm.
was palpable in the storyline.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such a hard chapter to write because it's the central relationship of his life. I think because it humanizes him. I think in a meaningful way. Um, and honestly, it was the last part I wrote. Everything Spock says about I've held off writing this was me too. How do you write about that? How do you write about Kirk and Spock? How do you? And then think, how would Spock write about that? It really was. I know some people felt that chapter was very short. That Kirk wasn't in the book, but I feel like Kirk is on every page. That it's the main emotional relationship of his life. I think, and I hope it does feel that way. Yeah, and again that Kirk Drift essay I think was very important. Sort of, um, made me reflect about Kirk very differently. So it was a hard chapter to write. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it felt that way. I like this discussion of Kirk because this is an argument I often get into. My initially I didn't like the Kelvin universe films
Mm,
precisely because of the portrayal of Kirk. I thought it sort of
yeah.
leaned in a little bit too much to that the pop image of Kirk, Chris
Mm,
Pine's portrayal of Kirk, rather than what I thought was really the essence of Kirk, which I often think, if you want to see that sort of real essence of Kirk, I often think about um, Kirk talking about in his Shakespearean moments when
yeah. Yeah.
when he's a conscience of a king. I
Mm,
think that that episode where he's sort of trying to be flirtatious, but also trying to
mm,
be an investigator. You really sort of see that kind of the complexity of Kirk in a lot of ways. And I
yeah.
think that I've come to terms with the Kelvin films. I enjoy them now for fun, but I don't feel. But
Yeah.
I feel that they put some harmful things out into the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, they're quite regressive on the women characters as well. I think that they're relentlessly male gaze in a way that you don't, almost in a way that is worse than the '60s because they should know better. Yeah,
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think the
yeah,
whole what they did to I'm forgetting the actress's name now, who portrayed Carol Marcus in
yeah,
the second film when they had this gratuitous scene of her in her bikini-like underwear. And I've read her talking, the actress talking about that scene, that she was very nervous about portraying that scene and essentially starved herself for like 6 weeks in order
oh,
to be able to shed what she considered to be the body fat necessary for that, and so that she
mhm.
was miserable, she was fainting, and it was a completely
It's just
gratuitous
insane.
scene.
Yeah,
So I really I don't forgive J.J. Abrams for having to insist on
yeah,
those kinds of scenes in that film.
yeah. Unnecessary. Oh, that's depressing. I didn't know that. What do you make of the portrayal of Kirk in Strange New Worlds? How are you enjoying that performance?
Well, that's an interesting point.
Mm,
Bringing this up, well, the first thing is that the sort of bringing in Kirk is
mm,
the Kirk of an alternate universe, the sort of alternate universe that Pike is viewing. Um, the sort of retelling of Balance of Terror. So it's
mm.
not Prime Kirk either. It's another
Yeah.
alternative. But when Kirk does show up in Strange New Worlds, he is much more of that studious,
Mm.
serious kind of person that you could see being teased at the Academy by what's his
Yep.
name, Finnegan, right? You
Yep.
can sort of see
Well
him,
done.
you
Yeah.
can sort of see him being much more talking about portrayals of Irish folk in Star Trek. That's
Yeah.
another sort of thing we should talk about. But you can see why someone like Finnegan would want to torment someone like Kirk when you see
Yeah.
him in that kind of young position. He's not yet the Kirk that we know. He's on
Mm.
this way, and you can see elements of the swagger, the smile,
Ye
the twinkle in the eye, but it's not
yes.
quite there yet. And a lot of people complaining that, oh, he's not really Kirk yet, or he's not
Well,
really
he's
being Kirk.
yeah.
He's on the way. I see.
Exactly, exactly. I also all of that. I also love how he's measuring for curtains whenever he's on board Enterprise. He's kind of looking around, going, "Yeah, I'll change that. I'll knock that wall through."
Yeah,
I love that as well. But yes, it's not that. It's not the smooth Kirk, is it? Of the Enterprise. There are
yeah,
still these edges of a younger man, and I really like it too. And so clever to bring Kirk on, but as an alternate one so
yeah,
that they could kind of trial run what's this performance going to be like, and then we could say, well, it's a different universe. He wouldn't be the
yeah, yeah,
same
yeah.
person. Really clever storytelling, I think. I really like Strange New Worlds, so I'm excited to see what they'll do.
Yeah, I want to talk with you about this new
Mm,
world, and we can perhaps bring in some of these characters. But I mean, speaking about Spock, I mean, I think that part of what I enjoyed about your work in the autobiography is we're starting to see the complexity of Spock's inner life in
mm,
a way that we haven't really gotten much of a sense of before in a lot of portrayals. But Strange New World Spock is a really fascinating character.
mm.
and you see him trying also to become the Spock that we sort of know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
struggle is very complicated. And what I liked about your work was you were able to show that learning curve, leading
Yeah.
to these
Thank
big
you.
emotional moments with the loss of Kirk at the end.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
no, so the very complicated work, and it's interesting to hear it as an analogous to academic work, which is something I want to get to.
Yeah.
Something I want to get to. So
Sure.
I want to talk about so you're someone whose work has many of your novels have been set in the DS9 universe, and you're known particularly for giving a real fleshing out in some ways the world of Cardassia and of the world of the Kardashians. And so I'm curious about your take as someone who
Mm.
um, is thought of as establishing part of the world building of the Star Trek
Mm.
universe. Your sense of the vision of the Star Trek universe. So, what I mean by that is something like this. In the course of doing these discussions with different folks, I've come to see sort of a continuum in the ways in which people understand Star Trek. In the
Mm.
popular press and popular understanding, Star Trek is understood as putting forth this kind of progressive vision of humanity, one in which we have overcome war and poverty. It's a more egalitarian world. It's racially colorblind, for instance. This was a lot of the ways in which the
Mm.
original series was discussed. In the past, say, few years, in the past 10, 15 years or so, there have been a lot of really insightful critics of this universe who have gone on to argue that, if you look at the Star Trek universe, it's laced with all these colonial assumptions or imperialist themes, the whole idea of going to where no one has gone before, but yet the planet is entirely filled with life. That's a kind of a colonial standpoint that no
Mhm.
one has ever been here before, but yet there's tons of people already here. Um, so my question is, there's this kind of continuum amongst in the universe of thinking about it as a progressive vision of humanity moving forward, one that it's just a retelling, a rehashing of old Western colonial imperialist themes, not really anything progressive. Where do you place
Mhm.
yourself in this kind of continuum? I mean, ultimately, what I would like to know is um, what does the vision of Star Trek as a
Mm.
possible picture of humanity mean to you?
Yeah. So it's all these things at once, isn't it?
Mm,
So and it's where you cut it. I'm going to be a proper niner here and be non-linear about it. You can kind of drop into Trek at any moment and go, well, that's progressive, and that's it's obviously and we're talking about a show that's been running nearly 60 years now, aren't we? It's a product of particular moments, isn't it? Particular historical moments, and it's a product of particular institutions as well. So it's always going to be inflected by those moments and institutions, for good or ill. Um, I think it's all of these things are true. Yeah, it reflects sort of American imperial activity in a way that perhaps American foreign policy doesn't necessarily do that itself. So it does reflect that kind of brashness and going out, and as you say, saying boldly go where no one's been before, apart from the people who are already there. So all of these things are true, and at the same time, utopia is process, isn't it? Utopia isn't there to be achieved. Utopia is the activity of being in the world and working with what you have and trying to imagine something in the distance and create the pathway towards it. And I think when it gets it right, I think it does two things. I think it critiques itself pretty well, and I think Deep Space Nine is the show that does this. Yeah, just sort of leading through things like arrival on Bajor and the Bajoran voices saying, "Well, actually, we don't want you. We've just got rid of the Cardassians," or the episodes that we see on Earth where we're very close to a coup d'état, Or, my favorite episode, In the Pale Moonlight, where they take an alien character, Garrick, and he diagnoses all the ills of the Federation and throws it back in Cisco's face. So DS9 is very, very strong on that critique. And I've slightly lost my thread now. So yes, it's process. Oh yes, it's very good. First of all, it's very good on critique, but
Yeah.
also I think there are two things that underpin it, which I think are really valuable. There's the emphasis on diversity, and that diversity is a good in itself. And this seems to me to be palpably true. Yeah. Just on a species level, that's good. On a learning to live with the diversity of humanity, which is just a fact. But you just need to get on with it and find ways to embrace it and enjoy it. Star Trek has that at its heart. And I think when it's very good, and TNG is good at this, and I think Discovery is pretty good at it. Discovery has some really good moments on this, actually. It's about a mode of being in the world which is curious, engaged, rational, but not blinkered, not kind of focused on goals, but not focused on ends, but on means. Um, and I think these are really good things. Yeah, it's that thing of having a vision of how a world can be and a pathway to achieve it, a method of being in the world. And I think that to a greater or lesser degree, Star Trek sort of weaves around that pathway. And sometimes it's disastrous, and sometimes it's, you're watching an episode and going, what were they thinking? Because they're making telly. They're not. It's difficult and hard, and people make mistakes. And sometimes it just really gets it right. And I think that's a thing to embrace and enjoy. I think where this really reaches its sort of apotheosis for me is in the novels of Vonda McIntyre, who novelized. She wrote 5 Star Trek novels, as well as an incredible body of work, science fiction work, her own stuff. 3 novelizations of the movies. So from Wrath of Khan, the next 3, and presents a vision of the Enterprise that it's exactly all these things. It's diverse in terms of species. It's diverse in terms of experience. She populates the movie novels with Carol Marcus, you were just talking about. Carol Marcus is foregrounded as a grieving mother, because we only ever see Kirk's grief. And she's the one who brought the kid up, So she populates the Star Trek universe with the people that we know must be there but don't get to be on screen. And throughout all her books, there's this sort of I think Nicola Griffiths has a very good way of describing what it is in Vonda McIntyre. Trust but verify is how you interact with other people. Trust but verify. Yeah. Don't be credulous, but be open minded and verify. Be rational about how you relate to people. And I think I think Vonda tapped into something that was latent in Trek, and sometimes there on screen, and really brings it to fulfillment in those books. The diversity and this sort of mode of being a person in the world, and being a full person, a fully actualized or realized person. So when it comes to where am I on the spectrum, I would say it's not a spectrum; it's a mosaic. Yeah, and it depends, because I bet that you and I could sit here and make a case for in the pale moonlight as the most progressive and also the most conservative episode of Star Trek. We could do those things simultaneously. So it critiques the imperialism, but it's a very cynical episode. Yeah,
Yeah,
very
no,
very.
very much so. I mean, and I think that, something that I do want to talk with you too is I think that NuTrek is leaning more into the sort of self-awareness of these kinds of themes, particularly, in lower decks. I think
Yeah.
that and we'll talk about that in a second. But the format of that show just allows for this kind of self awareness of the limitations, perhaps, of the universe in some way. But
Mm,
let me ask you this question.
mm.
In the introduction, I did mention that you had formal academic training, and hearing you speak about the universe, you're able to speak very deeply about the psychological traumas that shape characters, the ways in which characters are shaped by their experiences and the emotional resonance that they undergo. You are also able to analyze the universe from a standpoint of its cultural traditions, its mores, its fundamental principles. A lot of this, I think, represents ways of approaching the universe from psychological, sociological standpoints, and this is your formal academic training. So I'm wondering whether you've ever thought about how your previous life as an academic um, influences the way in which you choose to think about
Mm,
and write about the Star Trek universe. Do you ever find yourself? I mean, you mentioned that writing the autobiography was in
mm,
some ways an academic enterprise of the kind of grand synthesis that we like to do in
mhm.
work. Do you find this coming out in the ways in which you approach your creative writing about this particular universe?
Oh well, I was a very, very bad academic. So I was very slipshod and not detail orientated, and I much preferred making things up than learning things. So that's one reason that I became a writer. But certainly, I think it's. I think what it gave me was a kind of eclecticism of. I think every writer needs this, but you need to be eclectic
Mm.
in what you read, and uh, so I was interested in hidden histories and histories of the oppressed, and histories that needed to struggle to get heard. Um, but I found that I I could get to more meaningfully write about them if I abstracted them in some way. That I felt like I couldn't. It's very odd. I wonder what it was. Whether I couldn't quite authentically voice or speak for a real life situation, but that I could extrapolate and analyze and reflect and offer an analysis in fiction. And I think that's partly what happened. It let me investigate uh, questions from true history in a way that I didn't feel was exploitative, perhaps, or that allowed me to abstract in certain ways. Um, so it gave me freedom in a way that academic writing wouldn't have done, I think. And also, I was very bad academic to now. So,
Well, I
but
mean, this
yeah.
the reason I partly ask about this too is that
Mm,
um, I've spoken with many people who use Star Trek in their academic teaching in a variety, and Star Trek is very popular amongst the folks that I know, philosophy professors.
mm.
It seems like everyone teaches Measure of a Man in some way or another, if that's the
Yeah.
only thing that they ever use with Star Trek, which is interesting enough because I've never used that episode. But um, uh,
Why
what
not? Why not?
uh, I guess because I don't necessarily teach in that area
Fair enough. Yeah. Mm,
of the metaphysics of humanity,
mm,
but I do teach classes in ethics and political
mm,
philosophy. I'm teaching actually right now a class in the discipline of peace studies,
mm,
where we're talking about the nature of violence, war, aggression, and what exactly peace means.
mm,
And the way that I'm doing this now is I present them an episode of Star Trek, and then we
mm,
analyze it. And what I found is that sometimes using the episodes help the students to understand the
mm,
concepts that we're dealing with uh, very well. They can see how
mhm,
it plays out in the episode, The trick, of course, then is trying to then show like why the episode is an analogy for
Yeah.
something in the real world.
Mm.
But so there's kind of certain steps that you have to take to make it
Yeah.
applicable.
Hmm.
But I have found that sort of presenting the material from this kind of in a fictionalized universe first helps them to
Hmm.
grasp the notion of the concepts better than if I
Yeah.
just simply said, well, we're going to talk about the genocide in Rwanda today. Right.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Which, is difficult because, it's much easier to sort of say, well, let's talk about like what happened in the cloud city of Stratos and how they were oppressing the troglodytes.
Yeah.
And people are like,
Yeah.
yeah, I can see that. But it's, as opposed to saying, 500,000 people were killed in 4 weeks in Rwanda. That seems to them, in some sense, what I've gotten a sense, much more sort of abstract
Yeah.
in a way that they can immerse themselves more in this fictional world. The trick is, of course, then I have to bring
Yeah.
it around to sort of say, why is this relevant to something like Rwanda? But I
Yeah.
feel that the grasp of those concepts and the conceptual vocabulary is something that fiction helps really well to sediment, clarify in people's minds.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that's if you're teaching, if you say a fact like that about Rwanda, the horror of it, the reality of it is so immense that you can't stop thinking about it really. But to be able to reflect and analyze, to give that kind of cushion and to enable them to make that sort of those intellectual steps of understanding. I think that science fiction is a really effective teaching tool for that. Yeah, really interesting.
Well, and also something else I wanted, we were talking
Mm.
before we started recording about your work, and I asked you a little bit about it, your academic background. I also like what you said was the fact that you feel that, and I think that this is just blatantly true. Unless you're an academic superstar, you're going to be read by more people if you're a creative writer than if you're an academic writer.
I'm afraid it's true. Yeah,
Yeah,
particularly mass market things.
yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to flatter myself that people might pick them up and read them very quickly. They're reading a Star Trek book, they might just pick it up, flick through, and get the gist of the story, which hopefully is interesting. I know some people think I don't do enough space battles, but hopefully, if people slow down or read or know my work, they might go, well, I'll take a little bit of time over this. Una's probably put more than half a day's thought into this, so there might be something that I can get from it. And certainly, some of my books I've consciously been writing about um, restitution and reparations and justice and historical justice and these sorts of things. So they're things I've thought about for a very long time. I've been thinking about what you're just saying about peace studies. There's a wonderful line in Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire, where one of the characters is meditating why people never write an epic of peace, why but the line is something like, "What is it about peace that it doesn't endure? Why do we not sing epics of peace?" And I keep coming back to this line. I keep thinking there's a really good book in there somewhere, but I haven't quite thought out what it is yet.
That's
An epic of
fascinating.
peace,
That's
yeah, isn't it?
fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
The work of building and reaching out, and it's funny. I was just listening to John Hume, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for uh, work towards the Good Friday Agreement in Northern
mhm,
Ireland, and
mhm,
it was a 20-minute speech to the Bell Committee, I think, or
mhm.
the Bell body, and he was really good. He was really good on this. It's worth finding. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, what motivated him and what that work involved. That's I think it's and this is why I like Andor actually and Rogue
Oh
One
yeah.
is that we see we all know that Star Wars is a flyboy hero, yeah, but then we get to see the work of everything that had to happen and all the people that had to work incredibly hard to allow Luke to be able to kind of fly over and drop the the thing into
Yeah.
the. That's why it's so good, I think.
Yeah, and then what I
Uh,
like about Andor too is that you really get, in a way that really hasn't been resonant for me in the Star Wars universe, the sense of the menace of the Empire,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
because you really get to see how like what a fascist place it is, because you get to see the kind of banality of evil in some of the like the low level characters. Like, what does it take for someone to be motivated to support the Empire?
Mhm.
And what are the sort of levels of affiliation, and what are the kinds of traumas that lead someone to become a fascist?
Yeah,
You sort of
exactly that.
see some of that play out, and you're like, wow, okay, this is significant. This is really thoughtful in the ways in which the makes the empire seem really, rather than just sort of cardboard villain, really something
Yeah.
deeply scary.
There's an absence of aliens as well, which I assume is
Mm,
a considered decision, and I assume it's a sort of backdoor critique about racism that it's the empire is staffed by a species that by
yeah,
people that look a certain way, yeah, and the
yeah,
rebellion is diverse, and I
yeah,
assume that that is
yeah.
a conscious choice on their part. Such a good show.
Yeah, no, that is very true.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that Ursula Le Guin off talked when she was writing, for instance, The Dispossessed,
Mm.
her story of an anarchist utopia. She said that she was reading, anarchist essays. She was reading Emma Goldman and Kropotkin, and she was like,
Mm.
no one's ever written about an anarchist utopia in any kind of way. I want to do this.
Yeah.
So she was bringing her sort of academic concerns or theoretical concerns,
Mm.
and tried to use her fiction to illuminate those ideas that she didn't feel had been illuminated sufficiently in the theoretical works themselves. I mean, you were mentioning you sort of play with some of these ideas. Do you ever consciously sit down and say, I really want to talk about reparative justice? This is something that's been on my mind. How do I put this into my stories?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So,
Hmm.
so my most recent Picard novel, Second Self, uh, absolutely was about that, and it's something I've been thinking about for a very, very long time. So, what does Cardassia owe to Bejor? And how could that cycle of history be concluded? And can we get into spoilers for this book? We may as, I don't know. Well, okay. And refracted through a particular character, shall we say? Do the right. So and that had been on my mind for a very long time, and was part of what I was narrating through some of my earlier books. Um, and there are some bits in Second Self that I wrote more than 20 years ago, before I had a book deal, or was writing this stuff. I was writing this story, and some of I never posted it online. Never. It would just sat on my hard drive. I would come back to it every so often and tinker it. It concerned a certain character, and some of that, um, in quite substantially actually, ended up in Second Self, and that's all about what what do we owe to each other, um, when there are complex histories between us, and how can that cycle of violence be broken, and restitution and reparation and a genuine and lasting peace be made. So yeah, absolutely. I went off and read about, and of course, because I'm not an academic, I can read these things very quickly, and and just take what I need or what I want from them, which is the lovely thing about being a writer. Is you can be a sufficient expert quite quickly. But yes, I went and read some of the literature of that, and read around it, and sort of reflected on that. And the conclusion I came to in that book was that it had to be the Bajorans' decision. Um, so the Bajorans, in the dramatic moment where this all crystallizes as a in true Star Trek fashion, as a sort of the moment which exemplifies the grander scenario. it has to be the decision of the Bajorans who are there to break this cycle. But so yeah, I absolutely thought about that. I
Well, it's
don't know whether
fascinating.
yeah, I don't know what answers, whether they're good ones or not, but certainly they
Well,
were
I think that's
present.
the answer that Desmond Tutu gives in his notions of forgiveness is that
Oh,
it's the decision of the
mm,
victim, the survivor, about
mm,
whether or not they wish to give forgiveness.
mhm.
And so fascinating, fascinating stuff. Well, so the reason I really wanted to talk to you uh, uh, has to do with I wanted to hear your impressions about this amazing renaissance that we've seen in Star Trek
Mm,
in the past, what, 7 years or so,
yep.
since about 2017, which was the year that Discovery first premiered.
Mhm,
Since that time, we've seen this explosion of new Star Trek shows. You've mentioned Strange New Worlds. We talked about Picard. We've mentioned Lower Decks, and then of course the poor unfortunate stepchild of the Star Trek universe, Prodigy, a show I
yeah,
really love, and
me
I think
too.
raises
Yeah.
some really interesting questions about this whole issue about the Federation and Starfleet,
Mhm,
which is really at the central core of the narrative in Prodigy.
mm,
Uh, but I wanted to ask you about your impressions of this Renaissance. Um, and what's going on with it.
mm,
Particularly this. So we've talked a little bit about the vision of Star Trek that you were mentioning, um, this mosaic picture. When Discovery first came out, a lot of people criticized it for a variety of reasons, some sort of silly and
mm,
spurious, but one was that it leaned very much into the kind of dark, dystopian, edge lord kind of um, uh,
mhm.
uh, understanding of the Star Trek universe. A lot of people felt, oh, this doesn't have the hope. This doesn't have the sort of bright lights. It doesn't have the carpeting of TNG. Well, I mean, just on the side, whenever I hear these kinds of critiques of these current shows, it's always laced with all this nostalgia for
Yeah.
TNG, and I'm getting
Yep.
tired of nostalgia for TNG. Partly why, while I liked the third season of Picard, I felt that it was just trying to appease all these people that think of Star Trek
Mm,
as TNG, which I have to
yep.
say, probably one of my least favorite series. Uh,
Ah, how
so, uh,
interesting.
so yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I
Yep.
like the characters in a lot of ways, but TNG just overshadows so much of the universe in a way that
Mhm.
I think is unhealthy. So, anyways, that's my sort of like little dig. But I think that
Yep.
a lot of the critiques of newer stuff is Matt trying to put them up to the legacy of TNG and saying, "Oh,
Mm,
this isn't this." I wanted to hear what you had to say about these, what some people are calling new Trek.
new trick. Yep.
Do you think it's continuing on the themes that you've talked about in the Star
Mhm,
Trek universe? Do you think that it brings the kind of self-critique, the awareness that you talked about? You mentioned that you think DS9 is a really good place for
mhm.
that kind of internal dialogue of the universe. Is this something that you find in some of these newer shows? And amongst these shows, is there one that you find, or a couple that you find most impressive?
So I really like Strange New Worlds. And I love Lower Decks. I just listened to your half-hour discussion of Lower Decks, and I completely agree with everything you said. Absolutely right. You're completely right. It's the yeah, it's filling in everything, isn't it? It's all you said about technology and bureaucracy, and the people who are actually doing the work. It's all there. Um, lots going on here. Right. Okay. So, um, I agree with you about season 3 of Picard, which I think is uh very nostalgic. It leads into the nostalgia. I had quite a few questions about. I was quite uneasy about it. It seemed to end up in a kind of generational battle, and I got this uneasy sense. I don't think this was intended. That it was like the youngsters were infected by a woke mind virus, yeah, and it took the boomers to come in and sort it out. And then you had this sort of uneasy Generation X in the middle going, and I've ended up undercover and beaten up by Ferengi, you know. So it was very I found it, and then the way everyone was drawn into the sort of unifying family of Starfleet at the end, I found it quite a conservative narrative in many ways. What I did love, and I wish it had gone back to this, was uh, bringing in this question of the harm done to the changelings by the biological warfare. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because the big question for me for NuTrek, and this is a product of its historical moment in American history, is that it seems to consistently come back to this question of what do we do when utopia is under stress? And what do we do when utopia is in a decaying mode? And it seems again and again and again to come back to this question. And I think Discovery in a way is Discovery. I find quite an uneven show, and I think this is partly because of its the problems of production in the first season. The fact that they were learning to make Star Trek again. Okay, we can't. This happened with Doctor Who when it came back. They had to learn to make the show again. So I forgive all that. But once it makes that shift into the future, it's doing precisely this. How do we rebuild utopia with what we have around us? How what it's collapsed or decayed or been fractured. How do we reconstitute it? I think. Now, Strange New Worlds. I think it. Strange New Worlds. I think straddles that line of nostalgia in a really interesting way, because it's simultaneously, obviously, very nostalgic, but there's a freshness and vivacity to it that I think is trying to it's reaching into history as a source of vitality. Yeah. And saying that let us reach into our past. And there are obviously, there are mistakes made and all these sorts of things. But there are things of value that we can carry forward, and let's find vitality in them. And I think Stranger Worlds, particularly in the first season, does a really good job of this. I don't find it a nostalgic show. I find it quite a melancholy show, because it's shot through with Pike's self-knowledge of his imminent death. Yeah, and he knows what's going to happen to him, and yet Pike is this heart of the show and a source of comfort. He cooks. He's a source of support, of consolation, um, and he's doing this while simultaneously having knowledge of his own demise. It's really Trek for the Anthropocene, isn't it? I think. So I really like Strange New Worlds, and I think it manages that nostalgia extremely well. I think Picard season one did this too. It sort of went, well, what do we do when it's gone wrong? How do we move past the disillusionment, which is a shocking thing to see in Picard of all people? How do we move beyond that and into what steps do we take next to rebuild, to regrow? And I loved the new cast. I loved Raffi, I loved Rios, I loved Elnor. I really liked Jurati, who I thought was great. And I really, because that seems so much of the DNA of Picard for me, that kind of we have this long past, but a rupture happened, and now we have to reconstitute and rebuild. I really missed that from season 3 as well, which I think was looking for consolation in nostalgia rather than kind of regrowth and rebuilding. So that's my sort of take. When it comes to lower decks and Prodigy, I mean, you're right about lower decks. Just are Prodigy. It was quite tricky again to watch it in the UK, so I've watched it quite peacefully. I need to have a rewatch, but I think in many ways it's analogous to what Burnham is doing in season 3, that there's an idea of the Federation that they're striving towards. because they're not from the Federation, they're not from Starfleet. They've got a hologram who's explaining it to them, and they kind of go, "Well, okay, let's try that. Yes, let's try that on this ship and see whether that uh, um, makes us survive this or get through this." And I think that's what Burnham is doing in season 3. She's carrying an ideal in her heart and trying to reconstitute it in some way. And that seems to me what perhaps the crew are doing in Prodigy. But I want to go back to Prodigy and sort of think about it again. It's a very good primer as well, isn't it? This is Starfleet. This is beaming up. This is this. This is that. It's a good show. So
No,
that
it
would be
is.
my reading. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think it is a good primer in that kind of sense.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, I've said this before. My kids don't like Prodigy as much as they like Lower Decks.
Well,
Uh,
yeah. Well, Lower Decks is a delight.
yeah, it's just such a there's so much going on there. It's funny, and
Yeah.
the humor operates at a level that you can find just the pratfalls funny, but if you are a Star Trek nerd,
Yeah.
the deeper sort of humor about references and Easter eggs has a whole other level to it. So it's interesting in that regard. But I find this sort of notion. So this is something that I wanted to speak to you about. The question about hope.
Mm,
And Star Trek is often talked about as hopeful science fiction.
mm,
A critique, as I mentioned, of early Discovery was that it didn't seem to lean into that hope as much
mm.
of other places. And so I think third season of Discovery starts to reference that much more when you're trying to do this idea of rebuilding the Federation. In fact, a couple of the episodes there, right, I think are entitled something like "That Hope Is You" or something of that
Yeah.
sort, right?
Yep.
Hope becomes much more sort of an explicit kind of theme in Discovery as well. And I think that the premiere episode of Strange New Worlds talks
Mm,
about this kind of question of what can we hope for, particularly when
mhm.
they go down to that planet that's involved in this civil war. And Pike
Yep.
has that marvelous speech at the end in which he sort of goes through the history of the 21st century on Earth to talk
Yeah.
about all the destruction and the hope that came out of that.
Yep. Mhm.
So there are these moments in which we're talking about hope. As I've talked about on the program, Lower Decks leans into this question about like, well, who's doing this work of building hope? Um,
Exactly. Mhm.
who and what are the ways in which we fall short when we bureaucratize or corporatize the pursuit of hope. um,
Yep.
Prodigy, the reason that I like the sort of main storyline, this is kind of a bit of a spoiler, but um, part of what's really interesting there is like, is first contact with
Mm.
alien species really going to be a good thing?
Yep. Mhm.
So the whole mission of Starfleet going out to strange new worlds and to boldly go and meet new people, that sounds promising. That sounds exciting. What happens when it goes disastrously?
Mhm.
Uh, Lower Decks leaned into this and like sort of said, well, what happens when we don't follow up with societies? We make
Yep.
the first contact and then we sort of leave them for 50 years. Like what happens? Prodigy sort of suggests, might reaching out be disastrous for a
Mhm.
society, an alien society?
Mm.
I think that there's some interesting kinds of self-awareness of the ideals of Star Trek,
Yep.
but they don't abandon them in the face of these difficulties. They have to realize there has to be different ways to reconstitute those ideals for a new
Exactly.
understanding. And so
And
I do
and
think that you're
that's
right.
utopia's process, isn't it?
Yes,
Isn't
I
it?
think
Yep.
bringing back to that. I think that's exactly right. That your sort of picture or your analysis of what's trying to going on here with NuTrek
Mm.
is trying to make us aware that the utopia of Star Trek is something that is an ongoing thing that has to be reworked,
Mm.
rebuilt, rethought, and reunderstood. You don't abandon the principles, but you can't just simply apply box cookie cutter kinds of
Exactly.
solutions all the time and expect that they're going to follow out that way. We have to be conscious and aware of what our ideals mean, and if we're not, that can be really disastrous for society. And I
Mhm.
think that that is very uh, self-aware allegorically. of the
Mm,
writers for our societies like the UK and like the United States that are dealing with questions about diversity. What do we do
mhm,
with multiculturalism? There's very strong movements in both places that
mhm,
are rejecting the idea of diverse multicultural democracies
mhm.
and moving much more towards ethno state, in some cases, explicit fascism. This is a big
Yep,
struggle in our world, and it seems that the
yep,
NuTrek is trying to at least lay out the hopes we're thinking about our social ideals in these ways that might be able to help us to navigate these difficult kind of political times.
yep. Yeah, I think DS9 has always has the quote, doesn't it? It's easy to be a saint in paradise. Yeah, and it's and I think this is I think that these newer treks are wrestling with this in I'm sure it's a conscious way. These are good writers. Um, so, but but as I always say, I think that's part of utopia as method, isn't it? A conscious in the moment. First contact would be different from world to world. Yeah. Um, how you handle this ethical dilemma will be different in context. We can have a well established set of tested rules and methods. But someone's always going to throw you a curveball, I think. Yeah. And Lower Decks is good at that in particular, I think. It's more watched in this house by my kids than Prodigy, actually. The one we
Oh,
watch again
interesting.
and again. The two most watched episodes of Star Trek in our house as a family, because obviously there's me and my Garrick episodes, are the second episode with Peanut Hamper, the one with the
Oh, yeah.
bird people, yeah, and Fascination from Deep Space Nine. Yes, so there you go.
Interesting.
Yep,
Interesting.
who would have
Wow.
thought? Yep.
Well, we could go on and on and on. I think for hours talking about our favorite episodes, and perhaps we should do that at some point.
We should,
We
yeah.
should come back and talk about that. I want to ask you about where your work is going now. So I know that often happens in your work, reading about you, is that the studios, the people who
Mm,
own this IP, they reach out to you and they say, "Hey, we'd like you to write this." So you
yeah.
have this kind of direct kind of conduit to the people who are shaping this universe in a lot of ways, and you have your input into that process. So where does your work go from here? Do you have more that you're doing in? I know that you write in many different universes, not just Star Trek.
Mm.
What's next for you in terms of your work?
Right. Well, I have a couple of projects that I can't talk about yet, so I'll come back and ask me in a couple of months. So it's a shame. It's a bit unlucky, but I can't talk about them yet. I've just done a non-fiction Doctor Who book actually, so with a couple of very good friends of mine, called Whotopia, which is a sort of lovely encyclopedia, but again, it's very close to the autobiographies. Actually, it's sort of point of view and voices of characters and so forth. But what I think people might be interested in terms of what I've just written and what's coming, is my essay on Andor and Rogue One, which is an essay about the relationship between historical fiction and science fiction, and it draws on The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, which is that fantastic, incredible book of anarchist um, origin story making, which I just loved when I read it when it came out a couple of years ago. So I kind of I talk about the dawn of everything. I talk about a little bit of anarchism. There's Andor, there's Rogue One, and there's Garrick in this essay. So I think people would really like it. It's about historical fiction, science fiction. It's in a book called Writing the Future, which is a collection of essays edited by Dan Coxon and Richard B. Hurst. And then I think the other thing is funny, isn't it? It's all academic work. After I said I don't do any, I have an essay coming in a collection of essays about Star Trek tie-in novels, and it's an essay about the Star Trek novels of Vonda McIntyre. Um, so Vonda was a very close friend of Ursula Le Guin. They holidayed together, were extremely close, um, and wrote together. Great admirers of each other's work, and Vonda was a terrific science fiction writer, really, really good. Dream Snake, I think, is possibly her most well known, um, and was right in the heart of all those sort of 70s arguments about feminist science fiction. So the estate, Vonda McIntyre's estate, very kindly let me read her unpublished last novel, called The Curve of the World, which is a historical one, actually. It's sort of set in an imagined Minoan Crete, and it's about a voyage around the world. So a wonderful novel. It's mad it's not been published yet. So what I did was I took the Star Trek novels and I put them in the full context of Vonda McIntyre's oeuvre and tried to draw out the themes and the way she builds and constructs her worlds that are consistent throughout. And I had a lovely quote from the editor of the books, who worked with Vonda at the time. He said, you know, because she did the she did two really high profile novels. So novelizing Wrath of Khan. So Roddenberry novelized the motion picture, and then she novelized the three movies, and then she did one of the first big novels called Enterprise. And the editor was saying that, you know, there's the way Vonda writes Star Trek, that's absolutely in the DNA of Next Gen. That there's a little bit of what she does there, he believes is really a big influence on the way that Next Generation is kind of conceptualized and pans out. So she's a really wonderful writer, and the Star Trek novels are absolutely the it's Vonda's Star Trek when she, you know, you're not reading. This is Vonda's vision of the world through a Star Trek novel, and they're marvelous books. So that essay is about her whole body of work, and uh, yeah, I think, and fingers crossed that will be out this year. So I'm very pleased with that essay. I think it came out very well. Yeah. So
Are both of those out this year? Your two articles?
So the Andor essay came out last year.
Oh,
So
okay.
Writing the Future is already out, and then this one I hope will be out later this year. But otherwise, people could go and have a look at my Firefly novels, which I think are the most recent things I've written. So my last one was a sort of retelling of Charles Portis's True Grit. So I had a little. I think Firefly is very interesting because it's sort of it there's an uneasy, the more you watch it, you kind of go, you're just sort of being asked to cheer on the Confederates here, aren't you?
Yeah.
So yeah. Which I was a little bit, obviously, and you know, I took a bit longer to get to that just because I'm British. But that novel kind of goes into that a little bit. So
Interesting.
yeah. So but it's unashamedly a kind of rip off of True Grit, which is one of my favorite novels, actually. So so people might enjoy the Firefly books, I think, because yeah, the libertarianism is is really
Yeah,
interesting.
that's an
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, we could talk about that. I think that's been my sort of hesitancy to ever get into that. When I first saw this, I was like, "I'm uneasy with the analogies that are being thrown around here
Yeah.
with this universe." And so, but in any case, I think we have to have you back to talk about your Andor essay, because I'd like to
Oh
speak to you
yeah.
about Star Wars, and you know, we have talked about anarchism in Picard on the program before too. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. But I want to. We've talked so much about Star Trek. I want to talk with you now about Star Wars, perhaps. And so we'll have to have you come
Yeah.
back. But let me just say thank you so much, Una McCormack, for sharing your time and your insight with me. I am much appreciative, and I hope that we can continue to have these kinds of discussions.
Very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much for having me. So
No.
definitely back. Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. And I want to thank every one of you for tuning in and listening in. If you have any questions, if you would like to get a hold of us, you can get a hold of the Anarres Project on a variety of different socials. We're on X, formerly Twitter. We are on Instagram. We are on Facebook. We are on Blue Sky and Mastodon. So there's a variety of ways you can get a hold of us. If you are on YouTube, you can leave us a comment down below and let us know what you think about our discussion about the Star Trek universe and the writing process of someone who helps to shape the Star Trek universe, Dr. Una McCormack. I'm extremely glad to have had her here today, but thank you for showing up and let us know what you think. So thanks very much, Una.
My pleasure. Full Cardassia.
Live long and prosper.
Indeed.